jobs in the government who can then help them put influence back on their former colleagues. For example, the head of procurement in the Pentagon, who had helped keep the F-22 afloat for many years, the day he retired went immediately to work on Lockheed Martin's board. They also had people go into the government to do things like be in charge of military space procurement, be in charge of the nuclear weapons complex, work on the National Security Council staff, be in charge of promoting weapons exports to Latin America, where they've had some big sales. So they've become intertwined with the government in many ways. So not only does it affect the Congress, but it also gives them influence with the executive branch. And then finally, they've even worked with think tanks that have promoted systems that they have a stake in and help finance them. So it gives the impression that there's these sort of objective analysts, when in fact they're influenced to some degree by getting money from the company.
Describe for me the kinds of, now you stop short of calling it bribery, I guess, of members of Congress, although I guess, a lot of people would say that the big money they give in campaign contributions could be seen that way. But you do call it bribery, and how the company is operated in other nations around the world, regardless of what international law or U.S. law says about these kind of techniques. Give us some examples of that. You describe them in detail in the book.
Well, in the early 70s, Lockheed Martin went for a government bailout because they had messed up a major transport plane, the C-5, and had to eat some of the cost overruns. And then their commercial airliner, the L-1011, was running at a deficit. So they got the loan guarantees, but in order to pay them back, they needed big sales and they needed them quickly. So they were involved, for example, in an operation in Japan where they sent one of their vice presidents. And within a few days of getting there, first of all, he was working with a former alleged organized crime figure who had served time as a war criminal, who, when he was released, managed to get influence with not only the Japanese government but Japanese airlines. He was the conduit for bribes of $1.7 million for the prime minister, another $1.7 million for another key government official, payments to the airline executives, payments to members of the parliament, and so basically they spent in the range of $10 to $12 million in bribes. President Nixon spoke up on their behalf, as did the Prime Minister of the UK, which made the engines for the L-1011. They did similar things in the Netherlands, where Prince Bernhard was the conduit. They did things in Italy, where they gave so much money that they couldn't track down which Prime Minister was getting it, because there were several changes in government during the period when Lockheed Martin was paying the money. They did it in Indonesia. They did it in Saudi Arabia. So it became, in the 70s, kind of a routine way of doing business. And there's more sophisticated ways to exert influence over a foreign government. But this was basically just, cash, just sort of straight-out bribery.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia, and that sort of struck a chord with me, because Adnan Khashoggi was their point person over there. And the dollar amounts you cite, even though there were millions spent in Japan, it paled what was done in Saudi Arabia, which bought all kinds of U.S. hardware, right? And this guy was sort of the one carrying the ball for him.
Well, he had originally, his father had been a physician to the royal family, and that helped him at a very young age get connections throughout the royal family. And then he used those connections to basically say, if you want to do business here, you got to float us some money. And so he became the middleman. He made huge amounts of money himself, millions of dollars, and then additional millions to pass along for the bribes. And so every time there was a big deal, he would get a percentage. And he was actually arguing with them, should it be 2%, should it be 3%, should it be 8%? So there was constant haggling about how much the bribes and how much the fees for Khashoggi should be. But given that the Saudis, especially after the oil crisis, had huge amounts of money to spend, and spent a lot of it on U.S. and European weaponry, there was just a regular flow of money to the Saudi regime, skimmed off the top of these various arms deals.
Would this kind of behavior be considered illegal here? Is it in the U.S. for a company based here to be doing this abroad?
Well, it finally was. At the time, it was not considered illegal. In fact, companies were writing it off on their taxes, the cost of the bribes, which is quite amazing. But then as a result of these activities, in the 70s, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was passed, which outlawed this kind of direct bribery. And so it really was a question of, would the companies get caught? And could they find other ways to exert influence that didn't involve, straight writing a check, providing cash?
Talk to me about what we get for the money. As I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, the U-2 was a great example for the company. They did it under budget and ahead of schedule, and it was a fabulous success. But it seems like for every U-2, there's a whole bunch of examples where things did not come in under a budget. In fact, quite the opposite.
Well, the biggest initial problem was the C-5 aircraft, which was the largest aircraft ever to be built up to that point. It could just about fit in a football stadium. If you stood under it, the nose of the plane would be 6 or 7 stories above you. It had a power train that could be, enough electricity to power a city of 50,000 people. So it was an amazing plane, but basically very early on, they had big cost overruns, which the Air Force tried to cover up. And it was only when a whistleblower named Ernie Fitzgerald within the Air Force pushed the issue that it became public knowledge that they had run a $2 billion cost overrun on the plane, which also had serious performance problems, like the wings kept cracking. And in fact, they had some crashes that, tragic crashes where people actually died as a result. They also had the Cheyenne helicopter in the 60s, which cost about 3 times what they promised and was eventually canceled, but only after wasting hundreds of millions of dollars of tax money. And then, more recently, for example, they were supposed to build a series of ships for the Coast Guard. And there were 3 different varieties, kind of a small, medium, and large. And each of them had so many problems that they were not even seaworthy. And after spending billions of dollars, the Coast Guard had to go back to the drawing board and sort of start from scratch, building a new, more reliable design that was not promoted by Lockheed Martin and its partner, Northrop Grumman. So, there's been a lot of, overruns, sometimes corruption in how these things were covered up. And then, of course, the use of the influence of Congress to keep them going longer than they should have. So, I'd say probably on balance, probably more of these negative examples than the positive ones, although, there certainly were other positives. For example, they were the first one to build submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which also came in, close to cost. And, as far as we know, as a workable system, thankfully they've never had to be used.
Well, what about successes then? What would you point to as their great successes that have allowed them to coast along regardless of failures? Maybe I'll ask it in this context. How do you get away with cost overruns like that? Huge, huge amounts of money over and over again without consequences. Doesn't somebody at some point say, you don't get any more contracts, you've screwed up the last 3 or 4 of them? Or, doesn't anyone look at a bid and say, all right, you bid for this, you got the low bid, but we know you're lying. We know you're just doing it to get the bid and you're going to jack it up later.
Well, I think there's a couple things. One is collusion. For example, on the C-5, the Air Force knew it was a low bid, but they figured, once the thing got up ahead of steam, nobody in Congress was going to say, oh, we've spent $2 billion already, let's stop this thing. And in fact, some of the arguments to keep the plane going were precisely that. People like Senator Margaret Chase Smith said, we got to make the best out of this. We've already blown $2 billion on it. And, so the Air Force figured, well, if we come in low, Congress will, support this. And then later they'll have to support the cost overruns because we'll have them over a barrel. So partly there hasn't been, incentive or at least a history of the Air Force and the Pentagon driving a hard bargain with these companies. The other thing is the industry's become so concentrated now that a lot of times they have few choices. Sometimes there's only 1 or 2 companies. For example, now there's just 2 companies that build fighter planes. There's Lockheed Martin, which builds everything for the Air Force, and soon we'll also be building everything for the Navy and the Marines as well with the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. So, it's sort of like the adjective too big to fail. They're just in a position where they have very little other places to turn. So other than perhaps a fine here or there, or slowing down of a program, the government doesn't have substantial leverage because these companies are so large.
Well, talk to me for a moment about the consolidation, all this consolidation of these companies that took place in the 90s. I'm sure that they touted it as having, certain economies of scale and benefits to being so big, when in fact the opposite has happened. Now you're down to just, as you mentioned, like basically two.
Well, yes. There was, in the Clinton administration, there was this notion that, you could save money by consolidating, that you'd have fewer empty factories, you'd lower the overhead. And in fact, Norman Augustine, who went on to head Lockheed Martin, engineered some of the first mergers. Martin Marietta, which he headed at the time, merged with Lockheed. They then bought the L'Oreal Corporation, a $10 billion operation. Overall, about 18 or 20 companies were merged together to make Lockheed Martin. And what happened was, the notion of, well, you're going to cut overhead and you're going to save money was overwhelmed by the fact that, there wasn't anywhere to turn. And so a lot of these systems like the F-22 continued to go up, even as this overhead was, basically the companies pocketed the savings from the overhead. And in fact, the government even gave them money to help pay for the mergers, even things like golden parachutes for executives whose positions had been affected by the mergers were subsidized with tax money as a result of lobbying by Augustine and others. So it turned into what was touted as a deal for the taxpayers. It turned into kind of a nightmare in terms of the actual effects on how the tax dollars were spent.
There's a statistic that I think you use in the book. I'm trying to remember exactly. It's like $29 billion. And I don't remember what the percentage of all the money that the Pentagon spends each year on defense contracts, how much of that goes to Lockheed Martin?
Well, they get $29 billion a year in Pentagon contracts, some additional things for military-related items. And on the Pentagon side, they get about 1 out of every $14 the Pentagon spends on weapons. And their, spending of the $29 billion works out to about $260 a household, which I call the Lockheed Martin tax. You could just write them a check as easy as write it to the government because the money just passes through the government and goes straight to them.
So every household in America pays $260 a year to Lockheed Martin.
Just for that one company, which, the amount they get is larger than most government programs. It's twice as large as our State Department budget just for one company. So it's really an amazing sum, and as I said, much more than anything Eisenhower could have imagined for a single company.
And is there any company, is the second, we'll come back to that. The music's starting, so we're going to have to go to a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the prospects of whether or not Lockheed Martin has actually tried to push us into war, and whether there's a limit on what they will sell. Will they sell anything to anyone, even enemies or potential enemies of the United States? Our conversation with Bill Hartung, authors of Prophets of War, continues on Coast to Coast AM.